Hello, and welcome to our video series on understanding pharmacology for health professionals. In this video, we'll discuss Chapter 1 in our course, Introduction to Pharmacology and the History of Drugs. First off, the learning objectives for this chapter. Describe the origin and the meaning of the words pharmacology, drug, medicine, and the abbreviation RX. Describe the three general medical uses for drugs. Name several drugs derived from plant, animal, or mineral sources that are still in use today. Describe the types of drugs that were used in the past. Name 10 major pharmaceutical milestones that have occurred since the 1800s. Describe the use of mislabeled and dangerous drugs and the problem that they presented in the past for consumer safety. Describe the origin and content of the various drug laws. Describe the function of the FDA, Food and Drug Administration. Differentiate between prescription and over-the-counter drugs. Describe the 5 categories of controlled substances and give examples of each. Describe designer drugs and orphan drugs and their uses. And lastly, define the keywords and phrases for this chapter. Alright, first we'll start off with an introduction to pharmacology. Now, the study of pharmacology covers a very broad spectrum of very diverse but interrelated topics. Those topics can include botany, molecular chemistry, research, toxicology, legislation, and patient education. Now, pharmacology is amazing in its scope. It covers the historical and also the present-day use of herbs and plant extracts. Now, on a day-to-day basis, this is done by conducting very slow, methodical, painstaking research. And a lot of this research will produce products that are unusable. They have no real value. But it can also produce life-saving drugs. And it can also lead to other sources of research, including genetic manipulation. It can also lead to molecular pharmacology, adult stem cell therapies. So there's a seemingly limitless potential for discovery when it comes to pharmacology. Alright, now I'll talk about the origins of some pharmacology words. The term pharmacology is the study of drugs and their interactions with living organisms. Now, this word comes from a Greek root word, and that word is pharmakon, and that means medicine or drug. And then the suffix logi means the study of. So if we were to break down this term, it literally translates into the study of medicines and drugs. The word drug is from a Dutch word, droog, which means dry. And this is a reference to the use of dried herbs and plants as the first medicines. And the Latin word for drug is medicina, and this is where we get the words medicine and medication from also. Now, a drug is deliberately administered for its medicinal value for one of 3 reasons. It's a preventative agent, it's a diagnostic agent, or a therapeutic agent. And all that means is it's something that either will prevent something from happening, it will help diagnose what's happening, or it will treat what's happening. So a drug or medicine is a non-food chemical substance that affects the mind or the body. And even though drug and medicines, the terms are very related, they are different in some ways also. A medicine is done to diagnose, prevent, or treat a condition. A drug is something that gives a desired effect in the body. So cocaine, for example, there's no therapeutic or diagnostic or preventative reason to take that. But cocaine will result in a very specific effect on your body. So that's why it's considered a drug, not a medicine. Alright, now we'll talk about the medical uses for drugs. Now, drugs have 3 medical uses we just mentioned earlier: to prevent disease, to diagnose disease, and to treat the symptoms, signs, conditions of diseases. And the study of these uses is known as pharmacotherapy. Alright, the first one we'll talk about is the preventative use. And this is when drugs are taken to prevent the occurrence of diseases or conditions. Another way to describe this would be prophylaxis. And this term is from the Greek origin, which means to keep guard before. Some examples of a prophylactic would be taking Dramamine to prevent motion sickness before you would travel in a car. If you know that riding in a car, especially in the back seat of a car, gives you motion sickness, if you take a medicine before you even get in the car, that's a preventative use. Taking birth control pills, that's taking a preventative use to avoid getting pregnant. Vaccinations, you are being protected against diseases before you get exposed to them. Those are all examples of prophylaxis. Diagnostic use, this is when drugs are used either by themselves or in conjunction with a procedure or a test. Some common examples of taking a radio-opaque contrast dye, such as for checking for blockages in blood vessels or in your gastrointestinal tract. There's no other reason why you would take that kind of contrast dye if it weren't for that procedure. You don't take that kind of things for no reason. Another example would be a cardiac stress test. All right, this image we have an example of Dramamine, which is a very common over-the-counter drug used to prevent motion sickness and vomiting. Right, focus on healthcare. The American Academy of Pediatrics issues an annual immunization schedule to prevent childhood diseases. Now, all children must receive certain immunizations before they can go to school. Now, exceptions to this rule are granted for religious reasons or when immunizations aren't medically advisable. The third medical use that drugs are used for, therapeutic use, is to control or improve or to cure symptoms, conditions, or diseases. Some examples of this would include antibiotic drugs, analgesic drugs, and insulin. These are all given to treat or control something. Antibiotics are given to help get rid of a bacterial infection. Analgesics are given to relieve pain. Insulin is given to help lower blood sugar and control diabetes. So these are not used to diagnose anything. These aren't used to prevent anything. These types of drugs are used to control or to treat a condition. This image we have an example of Humulin, which is a type of insulin that some diabetics would take. Now we'll talk about drugs in ancient times. First we'll start off with the Egyptians. Now the Egyptians treated diseases with a large variety of different things, including the bile from a frog, sour milk, lizard's blood, pig's teeth, sugar cakes, dirt, spider's webs, the oil from hippopotamus, and toad's eyelids. And they also would apply moldy bread to abrasions. And there is some therapeutic use for this because mold is basically a very crude form of penicillin. Now there's a very well-known document when it comes to pharmacology from this time, around 1500 BC, a document called Aber's Papyrus. Contained the names of 800 different herbal formulations and prescriptions. It also described the use of extracted oil from plants for various healing properties. And even in King Tut's tomb, he had over 350 alabaster jars of plant oils inside them. So this papyrus is a very important piece of medical and pharmacology history. The Chinese practiced healing arts, and they emphasized the use of herbs and also some minerals. And these herbal preparations were used in conjunction with massage and exercise and acupuncture. Okay, the ancient Chinese used few animal products. They focused more on herbs more than anything else. And probably the most well-known pioneer of herbal medicine in ancient Chinese culture was Shen Nong, and he wrote the very first book on herbal medicine. And this book contained 365 different herbal remedies. Some other cultures, Native Americans, also used herbs as a way to treat disease. The Aztecs of Mexico made an effort to grow herbs with medicinal properties, and the leader Montezuma maintained royal gardens of medicinal plants. And the Greeks and Romans helped to further the study of medicine, not only pharmacology, but in all branches of medicine. Now, ancient drugs were prepared according to standard recipes, so by drying and crushing and combining a variety of plants and substances from animals and minerals. And the use of these recipes leads us to our next term, the symbol Rx. This is from the Latin word for recipe, which means to take. And this abbreviation is still used today, or it indicates a prescription. It was the combining of ingredients to form a drug. Now, as you can imagine, in ancient times, not as much was known about the chemistry of all these substances, so it was really just a matter of guesswork to see what would work and what wouldn't. So drug ingredients were really based on medical lore and superstition. Some had therapeutic value, a lot did not, and some were very harmful. Physicians in medieval times would prescribe a very broad range of drugs, including herbs and metals. An example of a common metal that would be used would be powdered gold. And they also would prescribe addictive substances like opium. And opium is a very good pain reliever, but it is so good it is very addictive. We'll talk more about that a little bit later in this chapter. In the 1600s, patients were advised to eat soap as a way to cure the blood in the urine. The thought was eating soap would help to cleanse away what was dirty inside you, and the blood and urine would just go away. Obviously, that's not going to be the case. Patients were also advised to put mercury into beer to help cure intestinal worms. So when it comes to helping to advise people on what herbs to take, what drugs to take, and in what combination, that leads us to our next term, apothecary. This is from a Greek word that means storehouse. So this is really a storehouse of dried plants and herbs. You could think of an apothecary as a pharmacy. And the term literally is a reference to the person in charge of the storehouse. And the first U.S. apothecary shop was opened in 1729. So they were in charge of using very precise amounts of small quantities of drugs and herbs. And this leads us to our next term, pharmacopoeia. This is from the Greek pharmakon that we mentioned earlier in the video, which means a medicine or drug, and poien, which means to make. So this is a list of all the drugs that are used in the apothecary, the individual ingredients, the strengths, the purities, and how to prepare them. So this is a book of all drugs that a pharmacy would use and how to make the certain drugs that you need. And the United States Pharmacopoeia was first published in 1820. Alright, now we'll talk about modern drugs that are derived from natural sources. Now, many drugs are derived from plants. An example of that would be the foxglove plant. And from this plant we get the drug lanoxin, which is used to treat congestive heart failure. Another example would be the belladonna plant. It's the original source of two different drugs, the atropine and scopolamine. Another common plant is the opium poppy. This is used as a painkiller and also used as a very addictive recreational drug. Now, the sap from the seed heads contain opium. Now, this is the source not only for the prescription drug of morphine, but also for the illegal drug heroin. So because it is such a very strong pain reliever, it can become very highly addictive. Here's an example of what the opium poppy would look like. Another example of a drug that's derived from a plant, colchicine, is a drug that's used to treat gout. And this drug is derived from the plant, the autumn crocus. Another example of a drug derived from a plant is the drug ephedrine. The Chinese use this drug to help treat respiratory ailments. And ephedrine is what's found in common over-the-counter drugs such as bronchodilators. Yams, this is used as a source of estrogen hormone replacement therapy. Daffodil bulbs, this is where the drug galantamine, which helps treat Alzheimer's, is derived from. Alright, in this table we have examples of plant sources and some modern drugs. For example, the French lilac flower is a source of metformin. The hot pepper plant is a source of capsaicin. Rose hips is a source of vitamin C. And willow bark is a source of common aspirin. So of course this is not an all-inclusive table, but it's some common plant sources and some common modern drugs that can be derived from those. Now, drugs can be derived also from animal sources. An example of that would include thyroid supplement drugs. These are composed of dried or desiccated animal thyroid gland tissue. This is used to help treat hypothyroidism. Another example of that would be a pregnant mare's urine. So this helps to form the drug Premarin, which is a female hormone replacement. The origin of the name Premarin actually comes from the term pregnant mare's urine. PRE from pregnant, then MER from mare, and IN from urine. Combine those together, you get Premarin. And this is given to help relieve the symptoms of menopause. The drug lanolin, a common ingredient for topical skin drugs, is obtained from the purified fat of sheep's wool. Insulin, in the past, the only source was from ground-up animal pancreas. In this image, we have an example of a Gila monster, which is a large and poisonous lizard that's found in the southwest United States and also Mexico. The saliva from this poisonous lizard is a source of the drug Bieta, used to help treat type 2 diabetes. Our drugs can also be derived from minerals. These will include individual dietary supplements, such as potassium chloride. For trace minerals, these are included with multivitamin supplements. And the drug Acupril contains red iron oxide as an inert ingredient. So drugs can be derived from not only plant sources, but also animal sources and minerals. Alright, now we'll talk about drugs in the 1800s and 1900s. And during this time, pharmacists had to prepare the drugs that they dispensed, as some had to be made daily, such as milk and magnesia, or paregoric, or syrup bases for liquid medicines. These couldn't be stored for days on end. These had to be made fresh every single day. Pharmacists also had to hand roll cocoa butter suppositories. Now, other drugs had to be measured out in very specific increments, and the apothecary system of measurements would include units such as minims or drams, ounces, grains, and scruples. Now, of course, much has changed since this time. Now, many drugs are completely synthetic, and other natural drugs are used to create new drugs. They're done so by undergoing chemical and molecular modifications. Now, a pharmacist doesn't prepare medications, but rather they dispense medication. And they also help provide education and patient information. Alright, next we'll talk about some major pharmaceutical milestones. 1806 is when morphine is first isolated from crude opium. 1853, Dr. Alexander Wood of Scotland creates the very first syringe and injects patients with morphine. 1899, the aspirin is introduced by the German company Bayer. 1908, sulfanilamide was first introduced. It's the very first anti-infective drug. 1912, phenobarbital is introduced for epilepsy. It's the first anti-epileptic drug. 1913, both vitamins A and B are discovered. 1922, insulin is produced. So it's the first drug developed to help treat diabetes mellitus. 1941, penicillin is introduced, and the first antibiotic drug. 1945, Benadryl is introduced, the first antihistamine drug. 1948, cortisone introduced, the first corticosteroid drug. 1952, thorazine is introduced to help treat psychosis. So it's the first antipsychotic drug. Also in 1952, hydrocortisone is introduced. It's the first topical corticosteroid drug. 1957, first drugs for anxiety and neuroses. 1966, clotting factors were introduced for hemophilia. 1967, Inderal is introduced for hypertension, which is the first beta blocker drug. 1970, levodopa is introduced for Parkinson's disease. 1972, researchers discovered the opioid receptor in the brain. In 1977, Tagamet is first introduced, and this helps to treat peptic ulcers. This is the first H2 blocker drug. 1978, the first portable insulin pump is introduced. In 1981, verapamil is introduced for heart arrhythmias. It's the first calcium channel blocker drug. 1982, Humulin, we saw this image earlier in the video, which is human insulin. It's the first drug that was made that uses recombinant DNA technology. In 1983, topical prescription drug hydrocortisone is approved for over-the-counter sales, not just prescription, but over-the-counter sales. 1985, ACE inhibitor drugs were introduced for hypertension. 1986, orthoclone OKT3 is first introduced. It's the first monoclonal antibody. Okay, this is an immunosuppressant which helps to prevent organ rejection in patients that received a transplant. 1987, Mevacor is introduced. It's the first statin drug used for high cholesterol. Also in 1987, Activase introduced for dissolving blood clots. It's the first tissue plasminogen activator drug. In 1987, AZT was first introduced. This is the first drug cocktail that was introduced to help treat HIV. In 1992, Proscar is the brand name for the drug finasteride, which is used to treat benign prostatic hypertrophy. It's basically an enlarged prostate. In 1993, Cognex was introduced. It's the first drug to help treat Alzheimer's disease. 1994, a combination drug therapy is introduced to help treat peptic ulcers that are caused by the bacteria H. pylori. 1995, the drug Cozar is introduced. This helps to treat hypertension. It's the first angiotensin II receptor blocker drug. 1996, Fosamax is introduced for osteoporosis. It's the first non-hormonal drug treatment. Also in 1996, Nicoderm was first introduced. It's the first prescription strength drug developed to help to stop smoking. 1998, Viagra is introduced. It's the first oral drug developed to help treat erectile dysfunction. 1999, Celebrex is introduced for arthritis. This is the first COX-2 inhibitor drug. 2000, deciphering of the human genome opens up the field of gene therapy for pharmacology. 2002, Botox is introduced for the treatment of facial wrinkles. 2005, Requip is introduced. It's the first drug developed to treat RLS, restless leg syndrome. 2006, Gardasil is introduced, the first vaccine against cervical cancer, which is caused by HPV. 2007, Exelon is introduced, the first transdermal drug patch is used to treat Alzheimer's disease. Also in 2007, Zyrtec is the first drug to have the same dosage strength for both prescription and over-the-counter versions. Alright, now we'll move on to mislabeled and dangerous drugs. Now, most physicians through history have attempted to treat patients accurately, and it's done so by using the knowledge that is available at that time. And in the year 2100 BC, the Code of Hammurabi gave very severe penalties for malpractice. Now, during the 1700s and 1800s, drugs were commonly sold without any kind of regulation. So these were accompanied by very extravagant claims of cures. And many of these drugs would contain very addictive ingredients that were never mentioned or described in medicine, such as opium or morphine or cocaine. Even when addictive ingredients such as cocaine were listed in the title, consumers were often not even aware of what cocaine was or its addictive qualities. Also at this time, consumer warnings did not exist, which led to the misuse of drugs, the potential for addiction to drugs, dangerous side effects, and a common thought was, let the buyer beware. So in other words, if you are willing to take this medicine, whatever happens to you is your responsibility. Drug legislation and drug agencies. Laws were passed in the 1900s to protect the public from unscrupulous drug sellers and worthless and dangerous and mislabeled medicines. The first federal drug law was passed in 1906, the Food and Drug Acts. This was amended in 1912 that required accurate labeling, and only drugs that were listed in the U.S. Pharmacopoeia or the National Formulary could be prescribed. Now, what led to the updating of the Food and Drug Act of 1906 was the sulfonamide tragedies. This was used as an antibiotic drug, and it was very, very effective, and there were elixirs made from a sweetened alcohol base. So not only did it work very well, it also would taste very sweet. Now, one thing that was not well known at the time was how toxic this drug was, and it's led to the death of a large number of children. And the drug manufacturer at this time did not need FDA approval. So this led to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938, which gave the FDA the authority to oversee the safety of foods and drugs and cosmetics. In 1951, the Durham-Humphrey Amendment was passed. This will require any drug that is habit-forming or potentially harmful to be dispensed under the supervision of a professional health practitioner. So this helped to define what is a prescription drug and what is an over-the-counter or non-prescription drug. The drug thalidomide, the FDA refused to approve this drug for use in the United States. This was still available in the United Kingdom and in parts of Europe and in Canada, but it became clear that there's a very strong link between this drug and birth defects. So there were 8,000 babies that were born with deformed limbs because of their mother took this drug while they were pregnant. So not only would it create some severe birth defects, it also killed several babies also. 1962, Kefauver-Harris Amendment, and this required that drugs had to show that they were safe and also effective before they could be marketed and sold. And manufacturers had to also report any adverse side effects. And because of this amendment, many drugs have been kept from being sold commercially or removed from the market. All right, a quick historical note. Because of the devastating adverse effects in unborn children, thalidomide would have been relegated to a obscure footnote in medical history. But it was discovered in 1997 that it could be used as a useful drug in treating cancers, AIDS, and also leprosy. So something that was incredibly harmful, incredibly dangerous for one condition can have some positive effects on another condition. Now, the potential adverse effects of this drug are so great that it's only considered an option for those life-threatening diseases. And the thinking here is, yes, it may give you some severe side effects, but at least you will be alive to have those side effects. The FDA regulates the use of thalidomide in two separate ways. It limits the number of physicians who can prescribe it, and it requires women who are taking the drug not to have sexual intercourse or to use 2 or more forms of birth control. So there's an even less risk of passing on these side effects onto the developing fetus. And in 2013, the drug Diclogis was approved by the FDA for the treatment of nausea and vomiting in early pregnancy. So basically an anti-morning sickness drug. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, this is the group that will weigh the inherent risk versus a drug's benefits. It completes the review process before a final approval or rejection is issued. In 1994, the Dietary Supplements in Health and Education Act was passed, and with this, the FDA has guidelines for herbal products and dietary supplements. In early 1990s, the average length of time that it took a drug to be approved by the FDA was around 34 months. For more critical drugs, the process would be shorter, such as in 1987, the first drug effective against HIV was approved in just 107 days. Now, critics still pointed to a time lag. Some drugs were available in other countries before the FDA approved them for use in the United States. So this lag time was because of the FDA process and approval of a drug. In 1996, Crixivan was approved by the FDA, and a record length of time, it was approved in only 42 days. And Crixivan is a drug that helps treat HIV infection. In 1997, the Food and Drug Administration Modernization Act, this gave the authority to accelerate approval process for certain types of drugs. So in 2000, the average review time was less than 15 months, and then drugs that were in critical need took as little as 6 months. Now, the FDA will allow physicians to prescribe some investigational drugs. These are for life-threatening diseases, and there's no other alternative therapy available. But this process requires an emergency treatment investigational new drug application, or an IND application. In 1996, HIPAA was passed, HIPAA, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. This will verify that health information, including all drug information that a person may take, is kept secure. And this information is only released to people who are authorized to have that information. The Medicare Prescription Drug Improvement and Modernization Act of 2006. This gave rise to Medicare Part D, which was intended to help reduce the cost of prescription drugs to senior citizens. In 2012, the FDA Safety and Administration Act. This is known as a breakthrough therapy because it helps the FDA to assist drug developers to expedite their review process. The Joint Commission. This is an independent, not-for-profit organization that helps to accredit and certify healthcare organizations throughout the United States. And they have developed a do-not-use list for what is acceptable and what is unacceptable medical and drug abbreviations to prevent confusion by patients. And they also help accredit state licensing boards. All right, now we'll talk about prescription and over-the-counter, or OTC, drugs. Now, the FDA will regulate prescription drugs and also over-the-counter drugs. Now, some drugs are only available with a prescription, or RX-only drugs. These are defined as those are not safe to use unless you are under the supervision of a medical professional. And these can only be obtained with a prescription by a healthcare provider who has a license that will allow them to write a prescription for that drug. Now, for many years, the distinction between over-the-counter and prescription drugs was pretty clear. For over-the-counter drugs, those are drugs that could be purchased without a prescription, and they were generally considered safe for consumers to use if the label directions and warnings are followed and the warnings are heeded. Over-the-counter drugs often are the same as prescription drugs, just sold under a different name. So in 1992, the OTC Drugs Advisory Committee was created. And this assists the FDA in reviewing drugs and determines which ones are safe and appropriate for over-the-counter use. All right, in this table we have examples of prescription drugs that became FDA approved for over-the-counter sales. For example, Miconazole, that's the generic name. The over-the-counter trade name, Monistat, are used to treat vaginal yeast infections. Fexofenadine, also known as, or by the trade name Allegra, is used for allergies. And terbinafine, sold as under the trade name Lamisil, which is used for a topical antifungal treatment. Now, the FDA will approve a prescription drug being reclassified as an over-the-counter drug if the following criteria are met. The indication for the drug's over-the-counter use is similar to its use as a prescription drug. The patient can easily diagnose and monitor his or her own condition while using the drug. The over-the-counter drug has a low rate of side effects or toxicity and has a low potential for abuse. And also, the use of the over-the-counter drug does not require the patient to have any special monitoring or ongoing tests. If all four of those are met, a prescription drug may be able to be reclassified as an over-the-counter drug. Now, supporters of the reclassification of some prescription drugs to over-the-counter status claim that this will lower drug prices and allow better access to treatment and therefore fewer visits to the doctor. Now, opponents to this argue that consumers may actually pay more because health insurance plans don't reimburse over-the-counter drug purchases. So people will have to pay out of pocket now for drugs. And excessive use of over-the-counter drugs may increase the number of adverse drug reactions. And consumers may try to self-medicate a serious illness instead of actually visiting their doctor to get appropriate treatment. So there are people who argue for and against reclassifying a prescription strength drug as an over-the-counter drug. All right, next we'll talk about scheduled drugs. In 1914, the Harrison Narcotics Act was passed, and it said that drugs that had the potential for abuse and dependence had to be regulated. This established the legal framework for controlling these drugs. It also was the first introduction to the word narcotic into people's vocabulary. Now, this act was replaced in 1970 by the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. And this requires the pharmaceutical industry to maintain physical security and strict record keeping of certain types of drugs. And so part of this act is where we get the classification system for different kinds of drugs. This act is more commonly known as the Controlled Substances Act. Now, it is the Controlled Substances Act that helps to determine what drugs are legal and what drugs are illegal, based on what classification they fall under. And Title II of this act established the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration. And this was done in 1973 to regulate the manufacturing and dispensing of these drugs. Now, the Controlled Substances Act divided potentially addictive drugs into 5 categories, or also known as schedules. And these categories are based on their potential for physical and psychological dependence. So these are also known as scheduled drugs or controlled substances. So labeling and packaging for a controlled substance and all of its advertisements must clearly show the drug's assigned schedule. So the manufacturing, the storage, the dispensing, and disposal of these controlled substances are strictly regulated by not only federal law but also state laws. And this is how a drug like this would be indicated. Capital C here, which would represent controlled substance, and then a Roman numeral within this part of the letter. So this would be a class 4 or schedule 4 controlled substance, because the Roman numerals IV indicate the number 4. All right, we'll talk about the various scheduled drugs. Schedule 1, extremely high potential for abuse and addiction. There are no currently accepted medical uses at all, and these are not available under any circumstance, even with a prescription. All right, some examples of a Schedule 1 drug would be heroin or LSD and ecstasy. Schedule 2, these have a high potential for abuse and addiction. There are currently accepted medical uses. These require an official prescription from a medical professional, but there's a risk of having severe physical and psychological dependence from these drugs. Some examples of a Class 2 drug would be cocaine, Vicodin, methadone, OxyContin, Adderall, Ritalin. Schedule 3, these have a less potential for abuse and addiction than Schedule 2. There are currently accepted medical uses for this class, and there may be a moderate physical or psychological dependence that may result from this class of drugs. Some examples here would include testosterone, anabolic steroids, ketamine, codeine. In this image we have an example of OxyContin. This would be a Schedule 2 controlled substance. And you can see on the label the capital letter C and then the Roman numeral 2. That's an indicator that is a controlled substance under the Schedule 2 classification because it has a high potential for addiction. Schedule 4, these have less potential for abuse and addiction than Schedule 3 drugs. There are currently accepted medical uses for this class, and these have a limited to moderate physical or psychological dependence that may result. Some examples here: Ambien, Ativan, Valium, Xanax. And then Class 5, a limited potential for abuse, and these are currently accepted medical uses for this class. Some examples here would be Robitussin, Lyrica, So the lower the number in these scheduled drugs, the higher the potential for addiction. So when it comes to these classifications, there's always been a long-standing controversy, a debate on whether or not marijuana, which is a Schedule 1 drug, should be available to treat patients that have certain medical conditions. Because one of the characteristics of a Schedule 1 drug is you can't get it at all under any circumstance, even with a prescription. In 1996, voters in California passed Proposition 215, which would allow seriously ill patients to use marijuana if it were approved by the primary care physician. And since then, 20 other states have passed similar laws. And also, the states of Washington and Colorado have recently passed laws that would allow the sales of marijuana for recreational use, not just medicinal use, but for recreational use. However, the federal law that prohibits the manufacturing and distribution of marijuana supersedes individual state laws. And in 2001, the U.S. Supreme Court agreed to hear a case that sought exemption from the federal law for the case of a medical necessity. Now, the AMA, the American Medical Association, advised that marijuana did provide medical benefit to patients with certain conditions, and many other groups supported the legalization of marijuana to varying degrees. In May 2001, however, the Supreme Court issued a decision that federal drug laws that ban the manufacture and distribution of marijuana allow for no exceptions, even for a medical necessity. So even despite this ruling, many patients still use marijuana to help treat their conditions themselves. Now, in order to prescribe or dispense a scheduled drug, a healthcare provider must register with the Federal Drug Enforcement Agency. It must be issued a DEA certificate and number, and have that DEA number clearly written on any prescription for a scheduled drug. Now, some states require the healthcare provider to also register with the state agency, in addition to the federal DEA. All right, next we'll talk about designer drugs. These are created by the molecular modification of an existing illegal Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 drug. And this led to the Federal Analog Act of 1986, which states that any substance that is similar to a Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 drug could be treated as though it were a scheduled drug. So just because it's slightly different, legally doesn't make any difference. It is still considered to be a Schedule 1 or a Schedule 2 drug. And there are some state-level analog drug laws that are similar to this federal act. Alright, next we'll talk about orphan drugs. In 1983, the Orphan Drug Act was passed, and the purpose of this act was to facilitate the development of new drugs to help treat rare diseases. Now, drug companies are reluctant to spend large amounts of time and money on drugs like this, especially if it only has a very limited market. So because of this, drugs for rare diseases were not being developed. So the Orphan Drug Act will provide special incentives for drug companies, including grants to offset any drug development cost, and also a tax credit that allows up to 75% of a deduction of the cost of the clinical trials. So in order to get a drug company to invest a lot of time, a lot of money into a drug that won't have that many customers, laws were passed to help encourage this type of research. The grants to offset the cost it would take, tax credits to help to offset the cost of the clinical trials. In addition to those, the Orphan Drug Act also provides special incentives, including a streamlined process for obtaining FDA approval, and also the exclusive marketing rights for 7 years. Okay, so rare diseases like ALS, or Huntington's disease, or muscular dystrophy, there's now more of an incentive for drug companies to research those diseases because they will get some financial benefit. All right, that brings us to the end of Chapter 1 of our course on pharmacology. We will continue our lecture series with our next video on Chapter number 2, Drug Design, Testing, Manufacturing, and Marketing.